what I want to do this morning is talk about the future of work, particularly looking at the issues of augmented and virtual reality. We are essentially talking about what does the workplace look like in a post-COVID area after, of course, the pandemic. So from our perspective at the National Urban League and from the workplace perspective, we are essentially looking at the past meeting the future. So how does that work? If you look at kind of what we're talking about relative to the future of work, you notice a couple of things here. You've got continuous and ongoing changes in the way that people are going to work. Now, folks talk about working from home. Certainly, there is working from home, but there is a combination of working from home and how do people get kind of that touch, that human touch, working from home when you're not in the workplace. The next aspect is kind of looking at the issue of hybrid work. So how do you do hybrid work? Because you see, hybrid work could be a great opportunity or a great risk, depending, of course, on the way that it is designed. If we look at the issue of virtual reality, if it is properly done, in our experience, it can be really an exciting opportunity for organizations to use. But in order to do that, what we had to do is look at some research on the last 2 years and how they will have a long-lasting impact on the future of work. From a dollars and cents standpoint, VR market is exploding. The projection, at least, is that it's going to be $92.31 billion in 2027. And China and the US are the biggest investors in VR. The expectation is, of course, that they're going to spend 5.8 or 5.1 on technology this year. But part of the difficulty from a learning standpoint is the fact that folks want to take what they have done in a stand-up training and simply try to put it in VR technology. That is an epic fail. It doesn't work. You have to look at learning styles. You have to look at how people process information. Because here's the thing. If what I'm doing is simply standing in a training room or a classroom and I'm trying to impart knowledge, I can't just take that and take some VR, use some avatars, and all of a sudden learning is going to happen. The research tells us that does not work. So if we look at VR, it's the question of the immersive experience. That immersive experience is what makes it so much easier and so much more effective. Now, when we are talking about VR, here's kind of well, there are a number of problems, but the main problem is the use of avatars. In a lot of cases, what people simply do is select these avatars. And they have the avatars playing the role of blah, 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 whatever that is in the context of the workplace. In our research, what we have found is that people find that to be too gimmicky, they find it to be too gamey, and so they're like, oh yeah, okay, this is interesting, however, what am I learning? A study by PwC found employees in VR courses can be trained on soft skills up to 4 times faster than in the classroom, and it shows greater focus and confidence in applying what they're learned. Now, for me, as an educator and as a professor, it's important for folks to understand what the end game is. What are the learning objectives? How are we going to measure success? Of course, the tool of VR gives us the opportunity to be able to do that. The problem we found, however, is the old problem of garbage in, garbage out. And by that I mean, if you're writing learning objectives that are unrealistic, if you're writing learning objectives that are not tied to what you expect folks to learn, how can you then expect to get an accurate measure? The answer is simple. You cannot. And so from a learning objective standpoint, it is important to set those expectations at the very beginning. Now, in the spirit, one of the arguably predominant VR trends of 2021 will be the increase across the organization, and particularly a number and a variety of departments. A lot of the training is either, the use of VR is either coming from the HR department or the safety department, or it can also come from learning and development. The other issue too, safety is a very important thing that can be done. Working with Moth and Flame, part of what we do also is we have developed VR courses for the military. One of them, we look at preventing sexual assault, how do you address sexual assault. Those kinds of safety issues are important. VR can, of course, amplify and intensify the lessons in comprehension. The research suggests that. So if we're looking at the growth, 21 to 28, the compound annual growth rate of the VR market is approximately 18%, maybe a little higher, but 18%. There is, of course, an increased demand for VR. Units of AR and VR devices are set to be shipped to customers worldwide in 2022. Now, what are some of the challenges? Part of the difficulty, because folks have been used to working in a workplace, a physical space, is adjusting your current culture to support a hybrid workforce. You have to be able to enable managers and leaders to manage a hybrid workforce. Some of the skills are the same, some of the skills are different. Upskilling leaders to lead in a hybrid environment. Now, 90% of HR leaders say that to succeed in the future, leaders need to operate in a more human way. The challenge, of course, is how do you translate this more human way into virtual reality? That presents a bit of a challenge.
What's a human way?
Well, here's what I mean by human way. So from the perspective of a manager, say we are having a discussion about how your performance is extremely weak, and we think that it's time for you to go. Well, the more human way of talking about that, number one, when you had a conversation, why is this the first time that I'm hearing my performance is extremely weak? Did we have previous conversations relative to my performance being extremely weak, how the organization would support you in making this work, or is it simply time for you to exit the organization? When we are talking about more human ways in organizations, from a leadership perspective, part of the reason that you're seeing the great resignation, the research suggests, is because, in fact, employees do not believe that they are valued in the workplace. Now, you could take a couple of perspectives on that. Perspective number one is then go work someplace else. But in the war for talent perspective, that simply isn't working. If you look at a number of establishments, you look at restaurants, you look at the airlines, etc., part of the difficulty they have with service is because they can't find people to work. And they can't find people to work in large part because people aren't feeling valued in the workplace. And so the organizations have to decide, is this a war for talent that I want to win, or am I fine with folks leaving the organizations? It's important to remember, when an employee leaves an organization, the employee is not leaving the organization. The employee tends to be leaving the manager or the supervisor or the leader in the organization. More importantly, there is the question in organizations of employees who quit and leave, or an employee who quits and stays. The employee who quits and stays is your worst nightmare. This is the employee that will do the basics. This is the employee that if they end work at 5 o'clock, they begin packing up their desk at 4 o'clock. But they will stay in the organization to make the life of the organization hell. And that's the reality that we find every day as we do this. Number 2, creating incredible training and education programs for staff. NASA was one of the first organizations using virtual reality. And at first, folks were not quite sure about how that would work. Well, it made sense since it was all about fast reflexes, etc. But then, slowly, many companies using the NASA model adopted the issue of virtual reality training. But again, let me say, when you talk about the virtual reality training, this is not the same as training or education on Zoom. I'll talk about Zoom fatigue in a moment. But when you're talking about virtual reality training, here's the rub, and here's why people learn more. Because they feel they are a part of the experience. That's the issue. They can see themselves in that situation, which necessarily requires that when you're designing the training, that rather than using avatars, you use actors. The use of actors, we have found over 2 years of research, has really made a difference from a learning and development standpoint. Video interviews. Now, interesting question with video interviews and virtual reality. It used to be that when you submitted your resume for a position, you would not put your photograph or any other identifying factors on there. And the reason for that, people argued, was that in fact, if you did that, it would be easier for the employer to discriminate against you based on color, based on gender, based on whether you had tattoos, etc. At least that was the argument. Now with virtual reality though, interviews are becoming an interesting use of virtual reality. For many employers though, the question is, do we actually have a virtual reality interview in which we use avatars to do the interview, or do we really create a real life scenario? So in fact, you could do a virtual reality interview in which someone is taken through a particular task for that job. If the person is supposed to be a project manager, for example, you could in fact design some project management task through the virtual reality experience. Again, folks are really confusing the use of Zoom versus the use of virtual reality. What you want the person to be able to do is to demonstrate those skills and competencies. And that can be done effectively through VR. Now, collaboration, the issue of collaboration and telecommuting. And this is a particularly difficult one because, in fact, when you have folks who are one organization that I work with where it is truly a global organization. You've got different time zones. You have different assignments. How do you get folks to collaborate on projects? Well, virtual reality can do that. Managers tend to be content with a conversation, as I said before, over Skype or Slack, and think that there's real-time collaboration. In fact, there isn't. When you put VR into the equation, however, what happens is you really cut down on the waste of time. Because what we found is that in the Slack or Zoom conversations, they're playing on their phones, doing whatever else they're doing, everything except paying attention to the particular situation. So the question is then, design through the use of VR some collaborative assignments. They don't have time to be distracted by the other things because that's really, you've given them particular assignments that they can do. You could even mix AR, augmented reality, with VR for a really good blend. And helping your support staff connect to consumers in real time is very important. VR really, we found to be a game changer here. If you give your sales team and support team, for example, a way to really interact with customers, this helps both your employees find ways to understand how to operate more effectively as a team and what the customers want. So, where are we in the VR space? In many ways, VR has already entered the mainstream. In some cases, much more effective than others. There's some significant quality issues with the VR courses that are being designed. In large part, they're being designed as an afterthought. They're sloppily designed. They're not any metrics, either quantitative or qualitative metrics that can be used. Research says half of the 18% compound annual growth in VR sales is expected through 28, and particularly in retail stores, car showrooms, and real estate offices. Now, the shift towards more distributed workers will in fact be a factor in workplace development. You know, Ari Lightman, the digital media professor, believes that there is a more broad move to DAO and using VR. The idea, of course, is that more people will be able to collaborate and communicate. Now, but here's the problem. When we look at the last couple of years, virtual meetings may actually slow the adoption of VR because people are really just kind of tired of the virtual meetings. They find it to be a waste of time. They find it to be, okay, whatever, I got to do it, let me do it. And it's the problem of what we call Zoom fatigue. Now, employers who don't see, the headsets, we are told, are simply too bulky. We can't really underestimate that issue. In addition to which, when you're using these headsets, there's some things that we really, really are not paying enough attention to. Especially, you've got practical problems like motion sickness. That is a side effect that most people don't experience, but enough people complain about it that it can be a barrier. The question in some cases that we have received from HR is, if we're doing VR training using the headset and a person gets motion sickness as a result of doing it, is that then covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act? The answer is no. It's not a disability. The question becomes, how do you moderate that? And the employer has an obligation to moderate it sufficiently so that we don't get into a problem. Learning curve for collaborative environments and scenarios we find may also be steep. It is the first issue of using this headset, using what some would call the joysticks, and how do you get people up to speed there. VR can be attractive for the wrong reasons. In large part, some people believe, that's the latest, shiniest object. This is going to be fun. I'm not actually supposed to learn anything from it. Data concerns, data privacy is a huge issue. How much information is being collected, shared, not managed, etc. Virtual fatigue, training in VR can turn into, for some people, a very uncomfortable and disorienting experience, particularly for newcomers who aren't used to wearing the headset for a long time. Side effects, headaches, eye strain, nausea. I sound like a commercial for pharmaceutical companies here. But the reality is that's what we've been experiencing. So a couple of things. Future of training and development is unfolding in the VR world. VR industry has had its fair share of disappointments, largely because it is done as an afterthought from a design. The technology is not always the best. We don't really effectively upskill people on how to best use the technology. We don't collect metrics on the learning objectives and outcomes. We don't know if people are getting up to speed as quickly as they need to. And then the lack of content. Lack of content is probably one of the biggest problems, in large part because folks don't know what they can or should put from a content perspective. Existing training, as I said at the beginning, is usually designed for stand-up classroom training. However, we've got some rapid advances in artificial intelligence. Affordability is one of the big issues. Level of adoption and integration presents some issues. With VR's rising popularity, it isn't about if, but when, and how much virtual reality can be effective in the workplace. Now, and so we at the National Urban League, working with Moth and Flame, are looking at the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course, is one of those issues that is working most effectively in the workplace. There is a call for this in the workplace. So, but before I talk about that, we're not talking about so-called woke training or anti-racism. We're not talking about that. The question for us is, when people come to work, we understand a couple of things. Folks come to work as different people. The question with diversity, equity, and inclusion is, how do we use those differences effectively to support the organization? Look, I don't want to work with everyone who is just like me. If I'm working with everyone who's just like me, there's going to be no innovation. What we're going to be doing is thinking the like. How then do we get better products and services if we all have the same ideas? So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there's conversation about equity, and let me be clear, when we talk about equity, we are not talking about equity of outcome. equity of outcome is problematic. Here's what I mean. The question in an organization is, are your processes equitable for everyone? Here's the other thing. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, folks always say, you're talking only about so-called minorities. First of all, I don't even know what we mean when we're talking about minorities. Are we talking about a numerical? But from our perspective, when we talk about this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is about, is it equitable for everyone in the workplace? That's your process question. Now, if I give everyone the opportunity to compete fairly and without barriers, where they end up as an employer, I don't control and I can't control, because there may be other factors that I don't know about. When you get to the question of equity of outcome, that's where you get into a whole woke discussion about rigging the workplace. We're not talking about that at all. Our question is, given the diversity of the globe, are we using that as a strength? It is not designed to tear the workplace apart by focusing on those differences. Everyone has differences. It is those differences that add value. That's what we're talking about. And when we talk about inclusion, the issue for us with inclusion is everyone included in the conversation? Folks, that's really, at the National Urban League and with Moth and Flame, what we're talking about. So if you look at who the National Urban League is, we're the leading advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Over 100 years leading civil rights, and we've got 90 affiliates in 300 communities. I have done 2 law degrees, a PhD in law, and also a PhD in life sciences. My work has always been around the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion. We, some 20 years ago at Cornell, created this diversity certification program in large part because we believe that there is a need for standards relative to diversity. In every other profession, you have standards. Diversity should be no different. And so for us, working with Moth and Flame and using VR, there are a couple of things that we're going to look at. Sourcing, selection, hiring, and development, and equity, as I talked about, in staffing decisions. Supply diversity. For us, with the supply diversity issue, the question with supply diversity is this, folks. We're not saying that organizations should simply select minority women businesses. And I use the term minority because that's the term that's used in the law. What we're saying is outreach to those businesses that you generally don't give contracts to. Here's why. It's an economic development issue. To the extent that you have gone through the process and they're qualified to do whatever it is you're seeking for them to do, you want those businesses to be self-sustaining businesses so they can buy your products and services. It's really just that simple. It's no more complicated than that. We look at issues of performance reviews. How do you target markets that you have not traditionally targeted? What about customer service? And then how do you do inclusive interviews? And so that really is the summary of my presentation. Okay, so thank you very much for your time in coming to this early morning gathering. Thank you. Enjoy Fort Lauderdale. Yeah, there is a question.